terminating a coffee break is one of the hardest tasks of a chairman. However, let me do it by introducing very quickly, because we're going to be falling behind if we don't do it quickly, introducing Mark Cousins, who is now going to talk to us. He's going to, let's get his title right. Yes, it's changed from previously. It's called The Locality of Thought. Mark teaches at the Cambridge Polytechnic. He teaches here at the Architectural Association, also in the History and Theory program. And he's also the author of, I think, a very excellent book on Foucault. So, introduce Mark Cousins.
I think that what I want to argue, is that there really isn't an opposition between something called rationalism and something called relativism. On the one hand, I want to argue that relativism is profoundly complicit with what's being called rationalism. And sort of one point, it's kind of, it leans on it, it's parasitic on it. Without the one, relativism really couldn't exist. It always needs the other to be uttered at the same time for it to play off. And that really leads into the second point that I want to make, or that I hope I will be making through the paper, which is that perhaps one of the characteristics of the human sciences, or whatever we want to call them, is that its knowledge exists always in two registers at the same time. It isn't, knowledge in the human sciences isn't, I think, usefully characterized in a simple propositional way. It is as if there is something which characterizes, which defines the human sciences in their specificity, it's not something that we can answer from the kind of philosophy of science. Is it scientific? Is it not? Is it a hermeneutics? Is it a this or that or whatever? Perhaps the answer is that what characterizes the human sciences is that each piece of knowledge exists in two registers, which for the purposes of this talk we might think of provisionally as the rational and the relative, but have other formulations as well. One of perhaps the more useful ways of looking at it is the couple, which is proposed by Michel Foucault, called the transcendental and the empirical. Those are the kind of themes which, if not consistently argued in this paper, I hope kind of come through. But first, I'd like to try and distance myself from the kind of drama which accompanies a lot of the kind of writing on these issues. The drama which talks about us being in a particular kind of moment. Perhaps it's a personal failing, but I always have a kind of radical inability to kind of feel part of these dramatic moments, or to kind of partake in this sort of sense of crisis in human sciences. I think I'm more sensitive to kind of repetition. However, a considerable amount of thought is given to the question, when does a certain kind of relativism assert itself? A lot of people ask, what sort of a moment is it such that relativism gains ground? Indeed, I suppose, following its own protocols, the relativist account of the conditions necessary for relativism to arise tends to assert that relativism only arises at particular moments. Now, at this moment, as a lot of people call it, at this moment, when also by a kind of relay of association, a certain link is established in a lot of arguments and discussions, a certain link is established within cultural journalism between relativism post-structuralism, postmodernism. It seems to involve thinking that relativism arises most fully after something. Indeed, the word after has now become an extremely popular word when thinking of book titles. I think this word after, in the 1980s, its parents really are those two words that people chose for book titles in the 1960s, which were towards or beyond. So somehow kind of towards and beyond begat after. And with this kind of family of beyond, towards, and after, it's very clear somehow that the idea of a moment, of a certain moment that's part of the time of thought and also part of the place of society, this concept of this moment, which crops up time and time again, is playing and serving some fairly powerful metaphysical functions. Powerful, and to use Paul's word, perhaps slightly unsavory. Now, this endless invocation that we're living in a moment becomes kind of rigorously ludicrous when the description of the moment is one in which we're described as after. This after seems to be a sort of math, which is after a moment, which was by antithesis, presumably, that of rationality, or structuralism, and modernity. A situation kind of loosely suddenly now described as one in which thought grounds itself in reason, by reason, and in which its productions, even its buildings, have foundations. Now, of course, since it is after that now, the order of knowledge and the order of social relations are deployed as being a field of difference. And of course, a field is not a ground, and a grid is not a foundation. Now, I want to make two points about the way such descriptions work, such descriptions as this moment we're supposed to inhabit. Descriptions which write us as postmodern, post-structuralist, or just relativist. Firstly, it's that the descriptions rely, obviously, for their kind of melodramatic effect on a rabid but rather unstated Hegelianism. To describe a cultural moment in terms of its abandonment of certainties may sound dramatic, but in fact it relies on the concept of moment, the way in which it comes after another moment in which other things were thought, has presumably now superseded them. Presumably the contradictions before have now been sublated. The way in which what occurs at this time has a coherence which may be represented as the present, and the way in which the two go together are displayed in the category of the moment. Now, all this seems to me is the kind of staple of a kind of rationalist historicism, a kind of return of the repressed, as it were, this kind of rationalist historicism at the very moment that this rationalist historicism was supposed to have been superseded, in the incoherence of this moment, which of course displays itself thereby as having a greater coherence. Second point is really to kind of cut the metaphysics and to insist that what this is really all about is the kind of propagandist function of soi-disant historical categories. These descriptions, while proposing themselves as a description of certain cultural moments, what is actually being advanced is a preference for certain arguments over others, for certain artistic forms over others, and in deploying those preferences, in deploying the kind of warfare of argument in the human sciences and the warfare within artistic production, it's all suddenly kind of dignified in a description which appears to step outside and tell us at what point we are in history. A point which is not a point, which is not a moment. It's simply a covert way of declaring certain intellectual, political, and artistic preferences. Perhaps I'll be able to kind of return to that at the end. What I want to do is to take just one issue which is raised in all this, the issue of relativism, and try to show how the field of problems which surround relativism are kind of both serious but kind of utterly undealt with the kind of jubilation with which these problems are kind of embraced. Within relativism, within a certain kind of anthropological relativism, the first move that's normally made is to insist upon the variability of human cultures and the plasticity, the variability, and the sheer difference of human cultures and human attributes. By preference, relativism always strains to point out the difference. Where you had thought that there was the same, now I show you that there's a difference. Of course, this is in no sense distinctive or defines a position we can call relativism. This is in concordance with the whole drift of the human sciences in the last 180 years. It wouldn't be in any sense distinctive or radical if that were the proposition, a proposition about variability and a proposition about difference, were it not tied to the epistemological relativism which Paul spoke of. What one often finds in relativist arguments is that, starting with the mundane recognition, the mundane sociological recognition that thought is shaped by social relations, it goes on to insist that it follows from this that truth is socially produced, where socially means a certain kind of coherence of culture. It goes on then to insist that thought, that forms of thought, and at the point where those formalize themselves, at the point of truth, that truth is irredeemably local, that truth is local through and through, and that there can be no metaphysical, meta-local discourse which can stand above, which can validate, which can judge, which can make decisions about the status of. To presume a kind of meta-local discourse is precisely to begin to forget the radical insistence that truth is irredeemably local. Now, when relativism is stated like that, when the insistence upon a social variation leads to an insistence upon the variation of forms of reasoning, and to the theoretical insistence on the local character of all forms of truth, and therefore that there be no delocalized discourse which will arbitrate. When it's put like that, a lot of people suddenly kind of react with a certain degree of kind of fear, horror, whatever. And this kind of epistemological relativism is thought to be mad or wicked or unsettling or just plain stupid. I don't think there's any particular need to be upset. I think it's wrong. I think what that epistemological relativism stated in the way I've outlined does, basically it plays the part of being a sort of poor man's vertigo. It suddenly seems to cut ground from under the feet, to kind of hold everything suddenly in an utterly unsettling way. It's thought to unsettle notions of rationality and of scientific discourse. It's felt almost as if the demonstration that to social differences correspond different forms of knowledge, as if that statement was actually equivalent to demonstrating that reasoning and knowing are simply customs, simply habits of the locale, simply, in trade union terms, local agreements. It's thought then to unsettle rationality with its claims to universality by postulating the invariably local character of thought, knowledge, and finally, and most radically, the local character of experience itself. And so, in a lot of the arguments, what seem to be pitted against each other is, as it were, one world as against many. Reason versus community. Universality versus locality. What I want to do very briefly is try and show that these oppositions are false. That in fact the terms of the opposition are both parasitic on each other. That is, that the matter is quite complex, but not as decisive and dramatic as it's thought. Let's start from the problem, as it were, that people feel unsettled and uneasy. They feel unsettled and uneasy, presumably, because, as it were, this statement of relativism, which we've just outlined, is commonly supposed to have effects upon the way we reason. Right? Once we've heard it, and if it's true, we can't go on, it's thought, saying the same sorts of things as we've gone on saying. It is as if the kind of enunciation of relativism has to have decisive effects upon the way we actually reason about things. Now, we're already in the turmoil, which I'm sure you've noticed, of a certain kind of paradox, right? It's as if the relativist position returns, having kind of made its voyages of discovery, it returns to our island of philosophy with the news of the purely customary character of truth, and is able to say to us, you think truth is universal, let me tell you, you are merely agreeing, stuck on this island. And furthermore, now that I've told you this, will you please change your style of reasoning to accommodate this truth, for truly you have been reasoning in error by referring to truth. Notice, as it were, in this exchange, both parties have, as it were, inseminated the other. Right? The statement of how you ought to correct yourself, now that I've told you of relativism, is stated in sort of purely rational terms. I don't think these terms mean anything, but I have to use them. I have to state it in purely kind of rationalist terms. I mean, presumably, if I not only reasoned like a relativist, but actually felt like a relativist, I could say, I don't care what they do elsewhere. I'm going to carry on reasoning in terms of the absolute, the universal, whatever. If that's what they do amongst the Azandi, let them do it. I shall carry on doing what I do. The relativist is in the rational position, then, of having to argue that we argue about truth falsely. After all, by and large, at the anthropological level, we don't feel threatened by what the anthropological relativist brings back. The insistence that the Azandi cope with misfortune in a way which is different from us, right, is not going to persuade me to abandon the practice of insuring my house and turning to witchcraft. I listen with interest to what they do. I want to understand it. But it doesn't actually worry or unsettle what I feel about my reaction to misfortunes. I don't feel threatened by the revelation of the sheer variability of forms of kinship systems, for example. Why then, when we're not troubled, by and large not troubled, by the representation of social differences, why do we become so troubled by this kind of epistemological relativism? Why does it seem to undo what we think in a way that my knowledge of what I do about misfortune isn't troubled by showing what the Azandi do? The reason why we're troubled by epistemological relativism is for a rationalist reason. It's because we suspect it might be true. And we suspect it might be true, not on relativist grounds, but on the kinds of grounds we reason about truth in general, if we're worried by it. Right? What I'm seeking to kind of suggest here, then, is that if it's seen to be destabilizing and powerful, it's because it's seen to be true, and its truth, therefore, isn't. Its truth is already outside relativism, as stated. Its truth is of the same order. Indeed, its truth is in the same order as the philosophical rationalism which it attacks. All I'm trying to show here is a certain profound continuity and sort of consanguinity in two very important matters, and it shows the deep continuity between them. The first is that both of them search for a place from which to judge, a place which has no location. Secondly, relativism, like rationality, seeks to repress and to debase the sources of its own thought and to idealize what is not itself. So I'd just like to try and kind of make those 2 points. Relativism, then, is a discourse which involves describing worlds under conditions which aspire to escape describing a world through the categories of our world. The consequence of this is that it requires, as it were, a worldless language, a locationless discourse, precisely to describe the locality of everything else. I don't mean that as a criticism, actually. I think that's kind of an inevitable consequence of the human sciences. But it shows that there must always be one more term than the term which is being used to describe the conditions of any object. A certain paradox, but a necessary paradox, a paradox which simply in the human sciences has to be endured, is that the idea of location, and a lot of the human sciences are about detecting and describing the location of objects, requires itself an outside of location. An outside in order to separate not just one world from another, but the possibility, as it were, of a certain division, I think, between an object and the capacity to kind of think an object. Put this way, then, relativism is really the search for a means of describing the conditions of objects which is not itself subject to those conditions, which in some sense is roughly the definition we've been given of rationalism. Therefore, at this point, relativism is rationalism. Secondly, the tendency to debase its own origins and to idealize that which is not itself. Relativism seeks to describe all worlds in neutral terms except one, its own. For example, in its own culture, it pits itself in a polemical fashion to undermine rather than to describe. Relativism doesn't function as a way of showing how we play truth games in our society. It functions rather as a kind of denunciation of our ways of doing it, insofar as they are themselves not in conformity with how relativism thinks things happen. It does not treat us with the dignity with which it treats the Azandi. It treats us as if we were in error. Indeed, in its radical form, it takes the form of saying, there is no error in any world save ours. In our world, in our errors, therefore, and again we come up with the paradox, precisely that it functions not as a description but as a denunciation of us. Therefore, this relativism is not functioning relativistically in respect to our culture. It's functioning in a normative sense. It's functioning as a rationalism, a form of the adjudication and measurement of truth and error. Let me try and put forward an example of the way in which that works. Think of a controversy which has now been going on for, in one way or another, all this century, about the way in which space is perceived and represented. Now, there are arguments about how space is perceived and how space is represented, and what the relationship between that perception and representation are, and what the relationship between both those and the world is. Now, one way, indeed the common way, of setting up this debate is to say there's a rationalism, there's a relativism. So someone would say, look, there's a rationalist way of setting up this problem which says something like perceptual experience is relatively stable across cultures, that there is, of course, it's admitted, an infinite number of functions to which pictorial representations could be put, like they could be for religious purposes or whatever. But if there is, within a culture, an objective which we might call mimesis, the objective of representing reality, then the means for representing space, there are means for representing space which are more true than others. Right? So, for example, within this, the rationalist case, the development of linear perspective is taken to be a real discovery. That is to say, a discovery of the order of science, a discovery of the order of truth. And its representation within pictures is taken as a decisive and as an unqualified real appropriation of the kind of reality of the world within representation. As against this, there is what we might think of as a relativist position. Within anthropology, we have lots of evidence, of course, for the different concepts, and perhaps even some evidence for the different experience of space. This is kind of, subject, of course, to limitations. I don't know of anyone who claims that it was a culture where people see round corners. But nonetheless, it's suggested that there are, at the level of experience, real differences. Now, in this view, pictorial representations of space, according to this, can't possibly be ranked on some continuum, true, false, more or less accurate. They can't be ranked according to criteria of kind of mimetic success. What these representations will be treated as will be as expressions of the culture of which they form a part. Now, in this sense, in this kind of relativist view, to kind of utilize a kind of phrase of Ranker's, as it were, all representations of space are equal under the eye of relativism. Now, I don't want for a moment this morning to try and kind of arbitrate any of those positions. What I want to try and say is that the situation between those two positions is more complex than the way in which I've just outlined it, although that's something like the way it's commonly outlined. What I think is the basic problem with making this division between the rational and the relativist position is that it misses out a crucial form of connection between the two, and it's this. One has to ask oneself, under what conditions can an attribute, in this case, the perception of space, under what conditions can an attribute be thought of as something which takes different forms? What does there have to be at the level of thought in that so that one can think that this is something which takes different forms? Very briefly, there are clearly, most cultures couldn't think a relativist position in respect to space, because many cultures don't have a concept of space. Right? Many cultures, of which the relativist draws our attention to, of course, lack themselves any form of relativism whatsoever. Their perception of space and their representation of space does not, and this is a kind of relativist point, does not necessarily take the form of being able to have a concept of it. It therefore follows that to be able to conceive the relativity of an attribute, one requires, as it were, and I'm kind of condensing the argument very much, but one requires a certain kind of formal and relatively stable order of concepts, such that attributes can be thought to be variant forms of them. Right? It seems to me that sort of link between rationalism and relativism, through which they both necessitate the other, goes kind of unrepresented. The point that I'm making is that for relativism to be thinkable, a high level of conceptuality is required. Briefly, something like a Kantian conception of space is necessary before, as it were, a relativism of space could be generated and thought through. That is to say, you cannot think the relativity of space across different cultures unless and until you're basing yourself on something like a Kantian conception of space. I think, I'm not sure, because I've never really understood it, but I think this is something of what Panofsky was seeking to argue in the paper, the sort of crucial paper on perspective as symbolic form, a way in which Panofsky both buys into a cultural relativism, and yet, as it were, he recognizes that the kind of Kantian space, inaugurated the level of painting in Quattrocento for Panofsky, constitutes, as it were, an unavoidable horizon for even thinking about these issues. The second matter, but I think there isn't actually time for me to do it, is to, I'll just say very briefly, that the second point after the question of perception that I was going to raise is the question of ethnocentrism. Because here again, it's important to show that the relativist position on ethnocentrism is profoundly Western, profoundly rational, etc. Usually, relativism makes a critique of our own system of thought by pointing out, as it were, that we're forever using our own terms for analysing the other. Could say, so what? But as it were, we're denounced, or we denounce ourselves for burdening the other with our categories. It's a sort of thought to be a sort of colonialism in knowledge. Relativism here then presents itself as what we might think of as being the protector of difference, of the integrity of the other. Now, if this were all, why does the description of ethnocentrism, our tendency to see others in our own terms, usually express itself as a political denunciation? Not only as a political denunciation, but as the revelation of an error. You know, what's wrong with ethnocentrism is not only that it is in some sense politically indefensible, it is traditionally erroneous. That's not how the Azandi are. You only think that because you come from Surbiton. In this way, relativism presents itself as a certain linkage between oppression and blindness, just as emancipation is thereby, in relativism, linked to truth. Now, I have no quarrel with that. I'm in favour of kind of emancipation. I'm in favour of arguing that certain things are true. My point is that this is a classic position of the Enlightenment. Right? That is, it is predicated upon values and proceeds by organised demonstration. The point I wish to make here is not simply to criticise this position, but to kind of detect the bad faith in relativism, the bad faith, as it were, by which it presents itself as having seen through rationalism. It has not seen through rationalism, Because if relativism seeks to make its point, it is condemned to make its point through ways which our styles of reasoning will accept, according to certain kind of rational order of argument and demonstration. I've tried to argue that there is not an opposition between rationalism and relativism. Indeed, to some extent, they both correspond to a profound movement of Western metaphysics, the attempt to think in a way which has no location about things that's called thought, about things which are called objects, and which always have a location. The emergence of the distinction between thought and object is also the distinction, as it emerges, between no place and place. Therefore, this situation, which is not easily avoidable, is precisely the means whereby the human sciences are always condemned to say two things at once. Things that have a place and things that don't.
We will get on immediately with the next one, very minimal introduction. Robin Evans, who I think most of you in architecture know well, is going to talk for the subject is fragmentation. Robin Evans is an architect and a teacher at the Architectural Association, as well as many other schools. So just quickly introduce you to Bob Evans. Fragmentation. Fragmentary thought.
I have to say that I already feel a little like the gorilla that Paul Hirst was describing in his talk at the beginning. And whether I'll actually attain to something as coherent as cup touches mouth or anything like that, I really wouldn't like to say. I can't predict that. But there is something very peculiar about the shift, to my mind, that I will have to make between the kind of conversation that we've been having so far and what I'm going to be talking about back in the compound with all the other gorillas. Because it's very difficult for me to talk about it in terms of an argument about the concept either of relativism or rationality in what I'm talking about. And I think if I did that, I wouldn't get very far. So I'm simply going to observe some things. What I'm doing is I'm taking fragmentation, by which I mean a particular appearance in paintings that occurs in a period between about 1907 and 1912, and just talk about some of the checkered history of this things that look like that over a period of time. I'll start. There's two other things. Firstly, I'd like to firstly talk about the way this appearance, which starts off in painting, travels into architecture, and what that entails, that transforming from one kind of practice to another. And I'd also like to talk about certain differences in the way in which it's talked about from the period of the 20s and now. I'll start off with, I suppose, an obvious case, which is where it's brought resoundingly into contact with architecture, which is in 1941 in the publication by Gideon of Space, Time and Architecture. Gideon, as you probably all know, wanted to construct in that sort of strange Hegelian way that art historians in the early 20th century were very prone to, particularly historians who had any affiliation with the modern movement, to try and construct a synthesis, a subsuming idea, which he characterized as an idea of space, which would connect science and art, or would connect within the arts, architecture and painting. And a great deal of the more general reasoning in space-time architecture is devoted to that end. There is a key comparison of two illustrations, one of which is Picasso's La Sienne, painted in 1907, according to Gideon, and a picture of the workshop wing of the Bauhaus. This is the kind of fragmentation that I see as the subject of my talk. This is the kind of thing which was a new characteristic in painting, a new appearance. That is very obvious. Things didn't look like this before. The first thing, which has actually already been said several times, and maybe it's fairly useless to say it again, but the first thing is that it's not at all clear that this is being fragmented. People have been talking about relativism, have been talking about the substrate, the thing through which one sees that it's relative, which must be construed of as more or less unified, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see that this thing was not coherent, that you were looking at. Now, here we have something which might be similar to that. What actually is broken, and what are the implications of that breaking, if indeed anything's been broken? I'd like to come back to that question. But the question of the transfer is sorry, I've been going the wrong way. There we go. This is the illustration with which it's compared. Now, what Gideon does, just to summarize the point, is to say that these two things show this space conception of the 20th century, it's new space conception, and they show also how it's related to contemporary physics, particularly relativity, which isn't, of course, relativism, it's relativity. And the way he makes the formal connection between the painting and Gropius's building is to say that there are two things that they share in common. The first of which is that there is simultaneity in both. Now, the simultaneity that he points to is in the workshop wing, the fact that you can see both the front and the side at the same time. Because it's made out of glass, you can do that. You can also see various of the internal constituents, the planar constituents of the floor and so forth, very clearly through the glass, so that it is as if the building, unlike buildings prior to this, were exhibiting aspects of itself which were not previously available within the context of the closed box-like masonry configurations with which we're much more familiar. That's one thing. The other thing is that they are both constituted out of planar elements, so that you look at the faceted form of the painting, and there you see these planar elements, which are taking precedence over the more usual forms of the voluptuous forms of the human body, which it's a portrait of a woman. And in this instance, the much more clearly exhibited facet-like character of the parts of the building and their component-like articulation. All very well. Let's go back just for a minute to this idea of simultaneity, because that then becomes the link whereby Gideon connects this to relativity theory. He says that in 1905, Einstein produces this work on electrodynamics, in which, he says, he makes a great deal of the concept of simultaneity, which indeed Einstein does do. But the point of Einstein's making a good deal of the concept of simultaneity is to show its complete irrelevance to physics. It's a concept which must be expunged from theoretical thought in physics, according to Einstein. So while Einstein was saying we will deal with the concept in order to tread all over it and throw it out the window, the implication in Gideon is that he was using it positively. And I think all this indicates is the extreme pressure with which Gideon was willing to put things which he probably knew very well didn't really fit together, as if they were all the same. To see this thing as a presentiment of some unified underlying conception that all people in the 20th century in the West are party to. So here we have both the architectural connection and, more importantly, I think, for this part of the discussion, this conception of simultaneity, because whether or not it has any plausible connection or not with Einstein and relativity theory, it is a concept which is used by various people during the early teens in order to describe painting, Delaunay and the futurists in particular, but not only them. This is also from Space, Time and Architecture, and it's a copy really of something which was done rather early by Rattan Thurman, who was who produced this photograph in 1934, which is really the basis for what Gideon was talking about, which tells us that in architecture, this idea of simultaneity can be shown in the way in which we understand an object like, for example, the Rockefeller Center, the skyscrapers there. As we drive past them or as we walk through them, we are presented with various aspects of the same thing, and there is some way in which the intelligence as well, kind of groups these things together and shows them as the thing that we're looking at. If we compare this with the very, very well-known metaphor from Plato about feeling the elephant, one remarkable similarity is obviously we're talking about the same thing. You can only see a bit of something, but there is a whole. But whereas the Platonic idea of the elephant is that we can understand the whole somehow from the parts, what's being presented here is something which must maintain its partial character. That at least in visual form, this fragmentation is a product of this accumulation of memory images, which are never properly synthesized in that way. So that to go back to Picasso and his portraits, this is a portrait of Vollard, Ambroise Vollard, which was done in 1911, I think. Sorry, yes, I knew there was something I should have done, which I've forgotten to do. That when one looks at this, it's as if we were looking at something which is constituted in the same way as that Thurman-Rattan illustration. Now, that's just to make the connection from Gideon. The other thing to notice is that an awful lot of the artists during this period are saying very similar things about what they're doing. Now, there is some argument about this. That is that some people, some contemporary critics, say that this is a ridiculous way to look at Cubism. This idea of a sort of synthesizing, but not quite totally synthesizing capability in the human mind to put bits of memory together and to add time into the equation, as Gideon put it, making another little foray into relativity theory by inference. And what happens, I think, for example, the way that Picasso describes his procedure in one instance is to say, about a portrait of a woman, again, that, well, if you took all the bits of the picture and you cut them out, and you stuck them together again in a different way, you'd end up with a woman. Now, nobody has to take that seriously as a literal description of the way he's painting, because it's quite clear that that's not what he's doing. But as a suggestion of the manner in which he conceives the task he's undertaking, it might be reasonable. If you Kahnweiler's description of Picasso's work in 1915 refers again and again and again to the same procedure whereby what has been done in these new paintings, it's not just a compositional idea, that's totally anathema. Of course, it is compositional, but it's not only compositional. It's doing something with the image, and it's doing something, even more importantly, to the way the image is conceived by us. It's picturing the very activity of the way we see, which is a privilege which can be obtained only by looking at things like paintings, and not necessarily at architecture, in a particular kind of way, with a particular kind of mode of address to the work. Let me just, the other thing, which I think there are many, many of these constitutive ideas about what the Cubists are doing. Now, we're very used to the idea now that they are fragmenting things, that they're breaking the world up. And it's true that even at this point, that idea is admitted, but it is admitted in a very, very small and extremely marginal way. If you look, for example, at Gertrude Stein's account of Picasso, there's only one point right at the very end of this thing where she makes any mention of this kind of idea of fragmentation. And she says, and it's a very general thing, not about his painting, but about the 20th century. And she says, so the 20th century is a time when everything cracks, where everything is destroyed, everything isolates itself. It is a more splendid thing than a period where everything follows itself. I mean, the Baroque is for her a period when everything follows itself. The 20th century, by contrast, having this fragmentation is kind of exciting. It's the excitement on breaking things up, which is the real interest in this kind of procedure. Of excitement burgeoning on elation. But it's very rarely stated. Most of the time, these people are talking about the scientific character of their work, its logical character, its rational character, and the fact that it is constitutive and synthesizing. I think the reason that they will keep rehearsing, I mean, Braque again goes back, says in an interview with Gellert Burgess, says that when he's drawing something, he thinks of it in the way that an architect thinks of his building. And he'll draw it because you can get all the sides of it at once, en face, en profil, like Gideon again mentions this characteristic when comparing those two photographs. So it's this synthesizing vision which leads to a kind of confusion of image, which is really important to Cubism. But I think at the moment, with the idea that there is something very, very interesting about the fact that it is not seen at the time as fracturing, or at least only just allowed to be anything of that kind. The other thing is that, well, let's go to the next slide. Yes, this was just a comparison between things that are actually broken and which is one kind of picture, and a picture which is easily understood and easily thought about. And the sort of breaking that happens in Cubism, which I think is fairly obviously different, that if one addresses it in the way that we're being asked to by the painters and critics of that period, then one looks into it as something in which not the thing has been busted. I mean, the person has been busted up into various little partial representations of him or herself. But it's not only that that's been broken, it's actually the pictorial space in which these things sit, which has been broken as well, which would appear a rather more radical idea of breakage than that of breaking things, and then illustrating the things that have been broken. Now this comes back to another thing which fascinates me in respect to this. One cardinal theme, one reiterated theme throughout the teens and 20s is that what these artists, painters generally, are doing is that they are destroying something. Now here again, it's difficult to imagine fragmentation without a correlative idea of destruction. Something must be under attack for it to be broken. There must have been, I mean, talking historically now, rather than in the terms that the previous speakers have been putting a rather similar idea, in terms of whether one can conceive of something as relative without some kind of superordinate overall conception. But here, it's a historical thing, that what we're trying to do is we're trying to smash up the unity of the classical pictorial space. Again and again, they make an amazing conflation between Euclidean ideas of geometry, which are historical, which you want to get rid of, because after all, there's non-Euclidean geometry around, and we need to be in line with that. And the other idea, which is that that perspective is the same as that. Perspective and Euclidean geometry are the same. Actually, they're not in the slightest degree the same. They're at odds with one another on a number of counts. But that really doesn't matter to these people, because what they want to get rid of is both these things simultaneously. Well, that's what they say. What they do is they do get rid of perspective. But how do they do it? They have recourse to the only other form of drawing imaginable. The only other form of drawing that, within the context of Western society, has been brought to the degree of generality where it could be said to represent anything completely, and that is orthographic projection. All these things about stereometric projection, architects' drawings, developing a surface, that is, unfolding this woman and reconstituting the bits, all to do with that image. Now, as I say, it's not literal, but it's there as a kind of undertow in the way that these works were being understood and accomplished at the time. The peculiar thing about that is that this is Euclidean geometry. What they're doing is they're getting rid of perspective. They're saying that they're putting a kind of Euclidean geometry, which they don't recognize to be Euclidean, back into it, but they're not doing it properly, and therefore they're getting something else, which is rather more than what they've said. Now, that seems to me an interesting kind of way of going about things. It's not very coherent, but it can be quite productive at times. These are just examples, which I'll go through simply because I think that the point has been said about the way in which this relation between orthographic projection or parallel projection and the construction of the cubist image goes about. I mean, we've talked about it a long time, it doesn't matter. What I'd like to do now is very hastily just point out one little problem that occurs here outside of the context of painting. There was, constructed by what means who knows, some considerable pressure to get ideas of cubist fragmentation into architecture. Now, I really don't want to spend too much time, sorry, I'm going back. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just one or two examples. When Corbusier turns painter in 1918 and starts producing canvases like this one in 1922, which you can see down the road in the exhibition, these are their cubist works, purified cubist works. They derive from Cubism, they have a lot of the actual elements of Cubism in, but one of the things they don't have in any large measure is what might be conceived of as the destructive aspect of fragmentariness of those early canvases that Braque and Picasso were doing between 1907 and 1912. That's been taken out. It is interesting that if you look at Timothy Hilton's book on Picasso, for example, most of the illustrations are Picasso drawings and paintings, but one exception is a Corbusier painting. Why is it there? Because Hilton wants to point out the desiccation that occurs when characters like Corbusier took up Cubism. That was the problem with it. That they would squeeze the juice out of it, is his metaphor, and produce things like this. Sorry, let's just leave that for a moment. When Corbusier actually builds buildings, I think it's a slightly different issue. Another way to get from the paintings into architecture is through the route mapped out by Duchamp-Villon when he does this Cubist house in 1914, where it's a very limited principle, as you can see. I mean, it's hardly worth talking about. I can see what the problems are with something like that without any problem at all, any further discussion. Likewise with Saint-Hilaire and the Futurists, there is a tremendous gap between what the Futurists are saying and doing in their representational, removed arts which are much easier to be radical with, and architecture. And when the Futurists take the thing seriously, you see, like this character here, who was one of the younger students of the Futurist movement, did this project for a house in 1916. It turns out as a kind of naivety in relation to architecture. It has many of the properties, much closer to what we've been looking at, but it has that quality of a kind of absurd naivety because this transfer is literal from one thing to another, and it leaves a lot else aside behind. It can't be addressed in the same way. Something else has happened with it. And in the rather more brilliant but limitedly photogenic projects like Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau, I think also suggest the limitation that this thing has, because this is one room of the Merzbau, and that's the one that's frequently photographed from two angles. They're the ones that look best in relation to this fragmenting procedure. And of course they're installations in an already constructed architectural frame. His house where he lived and where he rented rooms out to make a living. in Corbusier and in Doesberg and Gropius and these people, maybe we can follow Gideon to a certain point and say, yes, there is this, there are alignments between these things, but the really noticeable thing isn't the similarity, but given the fact that there was this pressure to transform some aspect of Cubism from painting into architecture, the incredible sublimation that takes place. I mean, most of the more obvious characteristics of Cubism are transformed several times over before they reach a building like this, the Villa Savoy of Corbusier. So at the risk of kind of speeding through this too much, I'd just like to suggest that there is a peculiar problem which is set up by the idea that there will be some kind of coordination or synthesis or underlying similarity between art and science and architecture and painting. Just let's go through this series of paintings here, because I want to point out something now. It seems to me a very, very strange aspect of this transformation. These are paintings by Lionel Feininger, and they start off using large German buildings, but painting them in very much in a rather more architectonic fashion, but painting them in very much the same way as Gris and as Picasso and Braque have been painting landscapes in about 1907, 1908. So he starts from this. And here we have another one. Very interesting here, the subject matter has changed. That is a large cathedral building. It's an old building, but it doesn't present any of its oldness. That's not the issue here. But here we have something called a ruin on the hill, and suddenly the whole perception of this thing alters. This is a drawing now of the same thing, done in the early 30s. And we can see here something which I'd like to take up, which is a very odd analogy, formal analogy, which we can make between what's happening in architecture, conceived of in this as more or less cubist-like fashion, as broken, fractured, and the picturesque, to which it bears a very considerable, I would maintain, relationship. Now, I don't think that that relationship is true of painting at all. I think it's only true of architecture. There's a ruin by Friedrich, painted in the early 19th century. The point that I'd like to make is simply this, that if you look at our conception of the picturesque is essentially of an extremely degenerate movement. And that picture, I think, is not entirely unreasonable, actually. It occurs at the end of the 18th century in the hands first of somebody who's actually quite radical in this country. That is of Richard Payne Knight. I mean, he's politically radical, and his work is quite radical. And he's interested in quite strange things, like the unrecorded rights of Sicilian peasants, which have to do with phallic worship and so forth. And he's so if you put all these aspects of Richard Payne Knight together, you get a very different kind of person to the normal idea of the advocate of the picturesque. But if you just go across a few decades, well, one is enough, to Repton, you see somebody of a very, very different stamp altogether. And it's now, and what I'd like to do now is to take Repton, see what he's saying, not just about the formal aspect of his work, but what its social implications are, and compare that to what happened in what I call the middling period after the war, which is characterized for me by the work of people like Venturi and Colin Rowe, in terms of statements about the way we might undertake architecture. Most of those published in the 60s and 70s. Whoops. Oh yes, I forgot I put this in. This is just interesting to me because it's an accidental version of Cubism, or at least what Cubism said it was doing but actually wasn't, is really done here by somebody who is opting for the picturesque which has been taken out from the landscape and shoved inside the family home. And if you look, for example, what happens here is there's three different kinds of representation, perspectival and orthographic, shoved together. two kinds of orthographic representation and one kind of perspective. And it's in order to sell this furniture. It's Gillo's company who do these things over a period of about 20 years. And you can see here that it's simply an effort to illustrate the furniture in the way they want to do. They make these terrible faux pas in relation to the coherent representation of space. But the reason they do that is also quite clear. And again, I can only summarize this now. It's because they want to break up the geography of the ground in the room. They don't want one constituent centre. They want lots of little bits in this room, lots of different bits of company, lots of variegated scenery within this enclosure. And for that reason, they get locked into this difficulty. They didn't have a way of drawing it. So we have here an accidental, and obviously I don't know how to suppose, cacophonous representation, which one wouldn't construe in the same way one construes Cubist painting, although actually the logic behind it is more essentially that described by the Cubists than what they were doing. But there again, I think the link is interesting, because the reason that they had to adopt this idiotic strategy is because they were trying to do something different in the organisation of the room. And that was essentially, it was both an aesthetic idea but also a social one about the way company is made and how people interact with one another and how they should do so. This is to go back to Richard Payne and Knight. I don't want to spend too long on this. The comparison, therefore, between the afterward of Cubism in architecture and the picturesque seems to me on the level of a kind of decomposing idea that both of them share. That is that you can take something that is whole in architecture, and you can, within the modest compass that is allowed to us as architects, fiddle around with the disposition of the elements of this thing in order to make it appear very different to the canonical, classical organisation with its order, its rhythmic and symmetry and so forth. These things have been obliterated, and it really is this kind of obliterating in intelligence now work. You want to get rid of something. There's a lot of things you want to get rid of, and therefore this strategy seems quite worthwhile. You can get rid of things, right? There's no doubt about it. Or at least you can obfuscate them. This is from Repton, incidentally, that particular example. Now, if you look at a great deal of what you might call mainline 20th century architecture, I think it's very much on those lines. To be honest, I can see a difference in, obviously, the way that the buildings are made. There is a compositional difference, too, but there is also an overriding similarity that distinguishes it from other kinds of architectural composition, classical or early modern or cubist or whatever. And it's in this kind of intermediate realm that most architecture is produced. It doesn't have the capability of being radical in the way that painting does, because painting isn't radical socially. It's a detached social activity. So therefore you can be quite destructive in painting. But in architecture, that's extremely difficult to be destructive. It's almost impossible. So what one does is have a kind of intimation of an idea of not quite complete structure and totality instead. Now, I think the guardian of this idea over the past 15 years or so has certainly been Colin Rowe, and that in publications such as Collage City, he makes a very insistent case for what he sees to be an idea derived from Cubism, which is collage, tearing strips off things, getting odd bits of something, which were part of something else, isolating them and then reconstituting them and making some other totality out of them, or some other constituted object. But the manner in which this is done, it seems to me, has undergone a very considerable alteration. In the frontispiece to Collage City, this isn't the actual illustration, but it's like it. If you can imagine all this coffering completely black, so that we see only the oculus of the Pantheon and its projected shadow fractured by the curved coffering, distorted and broken by it, that it becomes the kind of key image of this work. That's the first one. Here we have the totality of utopia, and here, by implication, the diversified scenery. Well, that's exactly the term that Repton uses. Repton is on and on about variety and diversification of this thing here. But now, you see, the peculiar thing, I think, here, is very clear in the way that Colin Rowe argues. This is a project that Rowe did in 1978, I think. It's the Rowe Minter-Rotterdam scheme, where he's illustrating this procedure. What he's advocating is not the kind of fragmentation at all that we've been looking at, but something which is of a completely different order. It's to say, well, we can take this little bit of history from here, and we can kind of pull it out, if I say, and I can put it back down here. And we can take that little bit, because we all know that we love walking through cities that are actually made like that have these things that come from different periods that aren't going to vary, which aren't the product of some totalizing vision. Well, all of that might seem very congenial, and indeed it's a congeniality which is the hallmark of the argument. But what we're after is some kind of congenial circumstance, some kind of congenial environment. Isn't it slightly odd that what Rowe is doing is taking an essentially Arcadian view of the past, taking an element of cubism, the fragmentary collage technique that Berlin is doing this, that, and the other with bits, and as it were, kind of bringing it into play in relation to this thing, whereas the cubism about which he's talking is in fact a really very excited phenomenon. What the ethos of everything that Colin Rowe talks about is one of a gentle congeniality. There's a poet, I mean, the people he cites, like Levi Strauss and Isaiah Berlin, they take the argument intellectually a lot further than Rowe is inclined to do. He cites those people. What his work is actually like, what it bears a very, very close resemblance to, is a poem published by Auden in 1955 called Utopia or... Sorry, it's not Eden. It's Utopia or Arcadia, that's right. In which Auden, in a very kind of plain, straightforward fashion, just compares the utopian ideas of the zealot with his ideas about a kind of Eden-like situation. And this Eden is going to be, it's going to be very variegated. I mean, everything's going to be variegated. The style of the architecture, the way people address each other, everything's going to be full of variety. So we're back to this kind of, this even vision of a kind of handleable difference within an idea of society, which is, again, I think, very, very similar indeed, almost indistinguishable from the kind of social ideas that have been put forward by people like Repton in the guise of writings on picturesque in the early 19th century. So we see that this thing has been taken from this rather vicious context of creating a new mode of vision in the early 20th century, but within the restricted field of painting. And in the larger, more effective field of architecture, it's been whittled down, calmed down, and made into something really rather charming. I think actually that there does seem to be some consistency in that. But the other thing that's worth noting is that over the past 10 years, an increasing intensity of going back literally to the fragmentation of the Cubist period in architecture. We can see that in actual built works like that of Caesar, Baron Caesar. But what I'd like to do is to just point out one peculiar aspect of this as it comes upon us now. I want to show you 3 projects from La Villette, all of which I think share in common that desire to, as it were, put the vitality, the sheer audacity of the Cubist enterprise back into architecture through the medium of representing it in some way in the architecture. That is Zaha Hadid's project for La Villette, and this is one of her early sketches. I'm really just going to go across these very quickly. This is the Omar scheme for the same place. Very, very different. I mean, constituted in a very different way, but nevertheless referring back to the compositional characteristics of early 20th century Cubism, one way or another. This, of course, is Bernard Tumis' scheme, the winning scheme, now in construction, which also does this. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that there's something very interesting about this resurgence of Cubist imagery in late 20th century architecture. I actually think that it's also interesting that because of the peculiar division that took place anyway between architecture and painting, that it's as if the idea of fragmentation was held in store while modernity took its course, and now it's come back, you see, hasn't it? It's been kind of it's been re-established as the way in which we, as opposed to the modern architects, who after all were all completely megalomaniac and totalizing, were undertaking their task. So that, I think, is a peculiarity of the thing. The one aspect of modernism has been held on ice and is now taken out of the deep freeze for later consumption in a different situation. The other is that while I think that it's very laudable for the people who do the scheme for La Villette, all these people, to undertake this revitalization of architecture, but I think there is something immensely questionable about the way in which it is done. I mean, that revitalization for somebody like Rem Koolhaas is very literal. It is also, I think, for Zaha. But I would like to just concentrate for a moment on Bernard, because mainly because there's another interesting circumstance, which is that in the last issue of AA Files, there was a text produced by Derrida, which is a commentary on the La Villette project of Bernard. Here we see the zoologist coming into the compound now, and he's busy with us, talking about what we do. And it's a very peculiar kind of liaison that this engenders. Firstly, if one looks at what Bernard has produced since, say, 1975, he starts off with ideas which are again to do with this fragmentation, again circuited round in some different way. That is, it comes from the Dubliners or from some other piece by James Joyce. That's what he's looking at in 1975. Then there's a period when he's talking about not so much fragmentation as a kind of illicit architecture. And here again we have this idea that something is actually being made much more dangerous in some way. So that with the Manhattan transcripts, this is something again which is presented to us. In the La Villette scheme, it's pure madness. It's a scheme that is somehow representing madness. That's what he says. Now, the peculiar thing to me is that it's actually not representing madness at all. It's one of the most rational schemes I've ever come across. It's rational in the sense that everything about it is explained to us. Therefore, it's very difficult to imagine in what way it can actually be mad. We're now back in a situation, it seems to me, rather like looking at those bits of fractured ice by Friedrich the painter, where we're being told that there are things that you can break, and we, in our unified space, can paint them that way. What Bernard is doing is calling on an iconography of fragmentation in order to present the idea that what he's doing has some kind of madness in it, which relates to contemporary ideas derived from Derrida and other people who looking at Nietzsche or at Artaud, or people who really were mad in part of their life, felt an incredible interest in these works. So you can see how this idea of representation is taking over here from something which is actually dangerous. It's not even naughty. It's actually very, very clear-cut and incredibly, brilliantly, and beautifully explained. So it's on those. It's on that note, really, that I'd like to finish, just pointing out as an instance of that, one of numerous instances in this project, of the way in which he shows perfectly clearly what the activity he's undertaking is in order to illustrate his own madness. So here, it might well be that even in this re-energized form, that we're on a very difficult kind of path, that it is impossible to re-energize something that has already passed and literally relive it. So it will have to live in the field of representation only. And if it's going to be that, then we can't say, actually, it's easier to go along with Colin Rowe than it is with Bernard on that line. So one would have to ask, under what circumstances would it be possible to use a technique of breakage in order to make something which was really more than simply a representation of the fact, but it referred back to early 20th century practices. And would that entail something which actually was much more vitally social, because we're talking about architecture and not art, which is slightly more distanced from, and not as involved in the construction of reality, not directly at least, which would have an element of genuine danger in it.